Hello everyone, and welcome to our 12th Inspiration Exchange session. My name is Nick Maxfield. I'll be moderating today's session, and I handle the Schaar Lab's communications. I'm also joined today by Mihaela van der Schaar and by two of our lab's Ph.D. students, Alicia Curth and Zhaozhi Qian, who will be giving presentations and answering your questions. But first, to give you an idea of what to expect from today's session, as always, our ongoing aim with Inspiration Exchange is to share and explore the breadth of topics in machine learning for healthcare and to generate new ideas for future research projects. And hopefully many of you will remember our previous session, which looked specifically at time series in healthcare. And we started by introducing medicine and healthcare themselves as a time series of sorts, and looking at some of the unique challenges in the time series setting, as well as some new approaches to tackle these challenges and potential new frontiers for future research. And one thing that was quite interesting about that previous session is that a lot of the questions, and we got a lot of questions in that session, but a lot of them focused or really kind of bridged the gap between time series and individualized treatment effect inference, or ITE inference, which made us think that maybe this session should focus a bit on ITE inference. And to some of you, this may already be a somewhat familiar topic. It is obviously one that's pretty much at the center of machine learning for healthcare. So it is a topic that we do plan to return to time and time again. But our focus this time in particular will be on what's around the corner. So really we'll be kind of introducing and discussing a bunch of brand new projects with you and new research areas. And we hope to hear your thoughts on them through this session. So to break this down for you a little bit time-wise, after my short introduction, I'll hand over to Mihaela for some kind of welcome words. And then we'll go into a live presentation given by Alicia Curth, one of our lab's PhD students. And then we'll go into two sort of mini presentations back-to-back by Zhaozhi Qian, another of our lab's PhD students. And these will take about 20 minutes and 15 minutes respectively. And in the latter half of the session, we will go into a Q&A on these presentations primarily. And then if we do have time, we'll shift into a bit more of an open discussion on ITE inference in general. Now, if you do have any questions on the presentations that we'll be showing today, please post them into the Inspiration Exchange Slack channel. And if you don't know how to join that, please just take a look at the email you will hopefully have received about 5 minutes ago with instructions about how to join our Slack workspace. And the earlier you ask your questions, the better it is, because there's a higher likelihood that we'll actually be able to get around to them and kind of list them up and be able to deal with them properly. So you don't have to wait until the Q&A to ask your questions. In fact, earlier is better. And then after about an hour, I'll basically just wrap up and tell you a little bit about our plans for our next session. But before I hand over to Mihaela, there are just a couple little sort of mini announcements that I'd like to make. So some of you may already be familiar with this, but our lab is now accepting applications for fully funded PhD studentships starting in 2022. If you are interested in this, please just visit our website and you can apply or register your interest. You can do so by going on our website and you'll see this sort of join us button. You click that, you get taken to a dedicated web page where there's a form you can fill in. So obviously, the earlier you do that, I think better it is for all involved, essentially. And we are also planning to hold a recruitment meet and greet event in December. Some of you may have seen this last time. I mentioned that this would be in November. We just decided to push it back just a little bit into December. Again, if you're interested in joining in, you can just register your interest in the same form on that same page. And another thing I'd just like to draw your attention to. So our lab recently held our 2021 open house. And this was an event we held on October 15th. It's a by-invitation event for some of our collaborators and sponsors. So at the time, it was a closed event. And what we did over the course of a few hours was present a wide-ranging showcase with about 10 mini seminars presented by our lab members, covering a bunch of research areas and projects. These are about 10 minutes each. And we grouped them around 3 broad themes of challenge, growth, and impact. And since then, we've now made all of these mini seminars available online, and we've included the reference materials as well. So if you want to see this, all you need to do is just click on the post on our main page or under our engagement mini menu on our website. And then you can see a dedicated webpage with all of these videos that you can either browse through or navigate to a particular one you might be interested in. So please, if you do have any time, just check that out. Well, now I'd like to hand over to Mihaela for her sort of welcoming message. And this is just going to be a couple of minutes. Again, I'd just like to remind you, if you do have any questions, please post them into the workspace on Slack.
So thank you very much, Nick. And I wanted just to welcome everyone to the session today and want to say that we all know that, like Nick has rightly said, that this whole topic of individualized treatment effects, conditional average treatment effects is a very important and vibrant area in machine learning for healthcare. But the community in machine learning for healthcare has mainly focused on just a few topics. And what I hope that you are going to see today is going to bring this topic in other areas and other domains related to this, whether it's treatment effects over time, whether it's multiple treatments, whether it's other aspects of this topic. And I really hope that the entire community engaged in this area can start to explore additional topics and additional problems related to individualized treatment effects beyond the standard topics that have been the concern of the research in the machine learning literature so far, which mainly focused on two treatments and just treatment effects in the static cross-sectional setting. So I really hope that the presentations today by Alicia and Zhaozhi can provide food for thought and discussion for the community, and we can together really bring this research agenda to the next level such that it becomes a lot more useful for the community. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So now it's time for our presentation by Alicia Curth. Sorry, this says 15 minutes. I think it's probably actually going to be about 20 minutes in practice. Again, just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions about Alicia's presentation or about any of the other presentations you'll see today, please post them into the Inspiration Exchange Slack channel. Now, Alicia, if you're ready, would you mind sharing your screen over mine?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia. I just finished my first year as a PhD student with Mihaela, and I've been focusing so far on individualized treatment effect estimation. So today we will look at some of the work that I've done in my first year. And as Mihaela just said, there's been quite some work in treatment effect estimation in the machine learning literature. However, it has been quite focused on one problem, namely the standard observational heterogeneous treatment effect estimation problem, where the main challenge has been framed as one of how to handle confounding. The outcome has been binary or continuous, the data has been static, and the treatment has been binary. What we have done this year is focus on moving beyond the standard setting. On the one hand, this can be changing the challenge, namely how to model how to model the treatment effects and the potential outcomes. This has been the first thing we did, and this will be the first thing I talk about in this presentation. The second thing is changing the outcome. And in the second part of my presentation, I will be talking about survival outcomes. And then later, Zhaozhi will be talking about taking treatment effect estimation from the static to the longitudinal setting, and from one binary treatment to multiple treatments. So let's start with a first paper, which is called On Inductive Biases for Heterogeneous Treatment Effect Estimation, which we will be presenting at NeurIPS later this month. And this is still in the very standard heterogeneous binary treatment effect estimation setting. I assume some basic knowledge of the setting, given that we've already had our first inspiration exchange on this topic, and hopefully you've watched our tutorials. So basically, we're just assuming a standard potential outcomes framework setting where each subject has features X, treatment assignment W, two potential outcomes of which only one is observed. And we're interested in the conditional average treatment effect, or CATE, which is the expected difference between the two potential outcomes. As I said, the main challenge that the the treatment effect literature in machine learning has been focusing on is selection on observables or confounding, which leads to different covariate distributions across treatment groups. And lots of solutions have been proposed. The challenge that we focused on now is a different one. And that's because even in the absence of all confounding, so when there is no covariate shift and the two treatment groups look exactly the same, Kate estimation is non-trivial. And that's because the label that we're interested in, which is the potential outcomes contrast, is never observed in practice. Also not when there's no confounding. And this is interesting because if you consider the plots on the right-hand side, where you have the two potential outcomes functions, which are quite complex, it's possible that the potential outcomes functions are very complex, but that this complexity is shared. And that the treatment effect itself is quite a simple function. So if we had access to the two potential outcomes, it would be much better to simply target the treatment effect instead of modeling the potential outcomes. And this is something that we explored in our paper. And that's because if you have something that we call indirect learners, which are learners that target the potential outcomes and not the treatment effect, you get some undesirable behavior. So an indirect learner, we consider indirect learners here as parameterized by neural networks. And basically, indirect learners have potential outcome specific regression heads H, which are parameterized by some neural networks. And the simplest one of this is a simple T-learner, should call it T-net here, which is two independent neural networks trained using some factual prediction loss. Another indirect learner is a TARNet type, where you have some learned feature space that is shared between the two potential outcome heads. And these features and the outcome heads are jointly learned using some prediction loss. But the thing is, you have an implicit inductive bias in this that you might not want, as normally these indirect learners are trained using some loss function that looks something like here on the slide, where you have a factual loss and some regularization of the weights. And usually the weights of these hypothesis functions are separately regularized using some regularizer, usually an L2 regularizer. And given that they are separately regularized, you get an inductive bias that says something like each hypothesis is simple unless there's evidence indicating otherwise. And here what simple means depends on what kind of regularizer is being used. So for example, it could be sparse, it could be smooth. But this can be problematic, and I will show you with a stylized example why this is the case. Assume you have a sample where there's no treatment effect, but if you split the sample and simply use predictive performance, and if you fit two regularized functions in these two samples, what you will get just by chance is that the simple functions that are being fit in these two samples will look slightly different, like for example here. So that even though you have no treatment effect and also no real evidence for it, the estimated treatment effect will be very heterogeneous, while the true treatment effect is actually 0. And this is because the inductive bias in such indirect learners, be it T-learner or TARNet, are not really targeted at the treatment effect. They're targeted at the potential outcomes, and the treatment effect doesn't actually appear in this loss function. But this also means that Kate heterogeneity, as I showed on the previous slide, can implicitly be encouraged, which is really not in line with the scientific null hypothesis of no effect heterogeneity. And this also really doesn't anticipate any kind of shared or prognostic effects, which are risk factors that are important regardless of treatment status. And this regularization also gives you no control of the implied Kate complexity. So what we did in this paper is to investigate how to explicitly incorporate inductive biases into Kate estimation. And we investigated 3 approaches modifying existing end-to-end learning strategies to encourage the use of shared or prognostic structure. The first thing that we did is consider a soft approach, which is regularization. And here we simply altered the regularization scheme and regularized not only the magnitude of weights, but also their difference, which is really what determines the treatment effect. And this is really simple to implement. It can be applied to any architecture with treatment-specific parameters, but it might also only have a marginal effect. Therefore, we considered a second approach, which we also call the hard approach, because we reparameterize the potential outcome functions. And here we parameterize the treatment effect explicitly as an offset function from a baseline, so that the treated surface can be expressed as the sum of a baseline and the treatment effect. This parameterizes the treatment effect explicitly and gives you direct control over the complexity of the treatment effect, but it also hard codes the assumption that the shared structure between the potential outcomes is additive, and that the treated function is the more complex of the two potential outcomes. And of course, this is not necessarily true. In reality, we don't know this. So therefore, we considered a third or flexible approach, where we use ideas for multitask learning and design a new architecture, which we call FlexiNet, that explicitly learns what to share between the potential outcome functions at each layer of the network. And this network has both fully shared and private parameters, where the private parameters determine the treatment effect at each layer of the network, and these are orthogonalized through the use of some orthogonal regularizer. This approach does not assume a specific parameterization and can learn what to share between the potential outcomes, so we expect it to perform well on average. However, we also think, especially in small samples, this might be more difficult to fit due to its flexibility. To evaluate these different approaches, we conducted many empirical simulation studies where we varied what we considered relevant experimental nodes. We actually, in a separate paper, we do also discuss some shortcomings of such semi-synthetic benchmarking, but I don't have time to go into this now. But in this paper, we mainly focused on using semi-synthetic data to understand when different strategies perform well. And we implemented all learning strategies using neural networks and focused on relative performance based on root mean squared error of estimating Kate. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of these results. However, what I can say is that we found that all three of these approaches can indeed improve upon baseline indirect learners, and generally altering model architectures, so the hard and flexible approach, has the largest impact. Okay, I'm going to switch gears really hard now and move away from this and consider a completely new problem now. This is the second paper that we will be presenting at NeurIPS. It's titled Survites, Learning Heterogeneous Treatment Effects from Time to Event Data. And this was joint work with Zhaozhi Qian, an ex-PhD student in our lab who just graduated. And here we move away from the binary or continuous outcome setting and instead consider survival outcomes. This is super relevant in medical practice, as many questions have survival outcomes. For example, how much the life expectancy of a patient with breast cancer increases after chemotherapy, or how much the probability of incurring a cystic fibrosis-related adverse event decreases after having received medication. All such questions require estimating heterogeneous treatment effects in terms of time to event outcomes. And because this is a composite problem where we have challenges from two perspectives. On the one hand, this is a heterogeneous treatment effect estimation problem where you, for example, can have confounding. On the other hand, this is also a survival problem where you need to model the dynamics of the underlying survival process correctly and where you might have right censoring. So the key question that we wanted to answer in this paper is what are the unique challenges that arise through the combination of treatment effect estimation with the time to event context, and how can we solve them? And from the deep learning perspective, this problem has really not been studied a lot. On the one hand, you have a lot of work on heterogeneous treatment effect estimation, which focuses on binary or continuous outcome. And on the other hand, you have a lot of work on deep survival analysis. However, this doesn't take into account modeling of causal effects of treatments. The intersection of these two literatures is super sparse, and we are only aware of one paper that uses a deep learning approach to time to event heterogeneous treatment effect estimation, where they do direct time to event modeling with balancing representations for confounding. We take a slightly different approach where we focus on the challenges in modeling survival dynamics, so things like hazard functions for heterogeneous treatment effect estimation. Let me now quickly go into the problem definition and how it's set up. Again, we have patient characteristics X at baseline and a treatment indicator at baseline. Now we denote by A here. And then there's discrete event and censoring times. However, only the smaller of the event and the censoring time are observed. So if someone is censored before the event occurs, we only observe the censoring time. And then there's a event indicator delta, which says whether what we have observed was an event or censoring. We focus on the treatment-specific hazard functions and related quantities. And the hazard function answers the question, given survival until time tau, what's the probability of an event occurring at time tau? And the survival function, which can be computed from the hazard function, answers the question, what is the probability of surviving longer than time tau? All the heterogeneous treatment effects of interest can be expressed in terms of the treatment-specific hazard function. As this is the basic unit for time to event related quantities. So from the hazard function, you can compute the survival function. And from this, you can compute things like differences in survival and differences in expected survival times, or even hazard ratios. So the treatment-specific hazard function is a interventional quantity. So also here, we need to make some untestable assumptions. And we rely on the standard assumptions of no hidden confounders, censoring at random, and consistency. And to enable non-parametric estimation, we also need to rely on positivity, that is non-determinism in, for example, treatment assignment and censoring. In order to simplify the problem for ourselves a little bit, we rely on trick from statistics where we transform the data structure. So instead of relying on the original data or the original outcomes, we construct a sequence of classification outcomes, YFT, indicating for each time step whether for each individual an event occurred at that time step. And then we use this at each time step to construct a classifier, which will then be our hazard estimator. So if we use this indicator variable of the surviving or population at risk to construct the classifier, we actually have estimated the exact thing that the hazard function captures, namely for each individual that is still surviving, whether the event occurs at that time step. So if we have some original data with the times and the event indicator recorded like this, at the first time step, we just use for everyone, we just construct a variable that captures whether or not the event occurred at the first time step. And then we just fit a classifier. And the second time step, we remove anyone who was either censored or had their event at time step 1 and repeat the same procedure, and so forth. And this approach has the huge advantage that we can actually rely on standard classifiers and standard empirical risk minimization to construct hazard functions. And there's only one downside, namely that we can only do this for the at-risk distribution. So that's the people that have, in each treatment arm at each time step, that's the people that have survived until that time. However, the actual target problem that we would like to solve is with respect to the marginal distribution. So we would like to have a hazard function that fits everyone equally well, regardless of in which treatment arm they were, and regardless at which point in time. However, it could be that these two are not the same, and that's because there's covariate shift from multiple sources. On the one hand, we could have confounding, so that then the treatment arms may already differ at baseline if covariates were used for treatment assignment. But even if we don't have confounding, so in a clinical trial, for example, we may have censoring. And if censoring depends on covariates, then the censored and the observed populations will start to differ over time. So for example, if older individuals are censored earlier, the population will become younger over time. But even if there's no censoring and no confounding, we can have something that we would term event-induced shift. So the composition of the at-risk population changes over time if the hazard depends on covariates. Again, using the example of age, if older individuals have their events earlier, then of course, over time, there will be less older individuals in the population. And if the treatment effect is also heterogeneous, so if a treatment is more effective for some covariate values, then this also means that the population will start to differ between treatment arms over time. Overall, this means there's a lot of potential for covariate shift, and the marginal and the at-risk distribution are very likely to not be the same. We then analyze the effects of this and provide a generalization bound on the target risk of a hazard estimator based on the literatures on treatment effect estimation and domain adaptation. And I don't have time to go into this now, but the only thing I'd like to mention here is that as it often appears in the treatment effect literature, there's this IPM term appearing that now penalizes the distance between the at-risk and the marginal distribution. So having done all of this, we then proposed a method for treatment-specific hazard estimation, which we call surveyed. And it has two quite standard components. We have a representer, which maps input covariates into latent representations. And then we have a treatment-specific hazard estimation, which takes in these latent representations, and then for each time step estimates the hazard function for each treatment arm. And the information is shared through this shared representation. And these hazard functions can then also be used to compute survival functions using like the standard identity. So then as loss function, we basically use a combination of two empirical losses. On the one hand, we have the observational risk, which is the log likelihood of the hazard function. And on the other hand, we have this IPM term, which encourages that the representations, that the distribution of the representations of all time treatment combinations are balanced towards that of the baseline distribution. And here we use the finite sample Wasserstein distance. And yeah, overall, this is how the architecture looks and how the losses are composed. And here again, we evaluated our method on synthetic data and constructed simulation setups that highlighted and isolated the effect of the different types of covariate shift that we have. For full results, you will have to refer to our paper, but for now, what I can say that we found that the introduction of the IPM terms leads to substantial improvements against both event-induced and censoring-induced covariate shifts, even in the setting where there's no treatment, actually. So we actually considered a setting without treatment to just look at this, whether this helps for censoring and event-induced shifts. And then when we added treatment and we add selection bias, then this helps even more. So this IPM term helps against all the shifts that we considered. So I hope I sparked your interest in some of our work. If you are interested, these three are the papers that I will be presenting at NeurIPS next month. And there's also code available for both papers on these GitHubs. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed Zhaozhi's presentations now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alicia. So as Alicia mentioned, it's now time for two presentations by Zhaozhi Qian. Zhaozhi is a PhD student who joined our lab in 2019, and these are kind of given back to back. They're pre-recorded, and in total, they will be about 15 minutes. Again, please post any questions you have on either of these presentations into our Inspiration Exchange Slack channel. And if you haven't joined yet, you can find the URL in any of the previous emails I've sent about this event. So Zhaozhi's first presentation is on SyncTwin, which is another project that will be presented at NeurIPS 2021.
Hello, welcome to the presentation of SyncTwin, treatment effect estimation with longitudinal outcomes. I'm the presenter, Zhaozhi. This work is done by me and my collaborators, Yao Zhang, Ivana Bika, Angela Wood, and my supervisor, Mihaela van der Schaar. In this work, we consider the problem of estimating individualized treatment effect in medical observational studies which use data from electronic health records. In particular, we focus on the scenario with the LEAP setting, longitudinal, irregular, and point treatment. As illustrated in the figure, the outcomes of interest are observed over time before and after the treatment. The temporal covariates are also observed over time, possibly at irregular intervals. The treatment is allocated at some moment in time and stays fixed during the study. The LEAP setting is important for medical problems because it captures the characteristics of EHR data. The patient's health status are measured longitudinally at irregular intervals. Furthermore, the treatment effect on clinical outcomes may be time-varying, and it is important to understand the effect over different time horizons, both in terms of therapeutic effect and adverse effects. Finally, the point treatment is also widely applicable. Very often, the allocation is fixed within the treatment regime, which can be weeks or even years. It can also capture one-off treatments, such as surgical interventions or transplants. However, the ITE estimators tailored for the LEAP setting is currently underdeveloped. Most works consider the static setting, which does not involve any temporal aspect. Some works address the more challenging dynamic treatment setting, where treatment allocation can change during the study. The works in the synthetic control literature addresses the LEAP setting, but it makes strong assumptions on the data generating process. The key insight of SyncTwin is to fully leverage the pretreatment outcomes. These outcomes are not influenced by the treatment, and they may give information about the counterfactual outcomes due to the temporal structure in the time series. Unlike existing methods which ignore pretreatment outcomes or treat them as temporal covariates, SyncTwin explicitly models the outcome time series. As we will show later, this can improve the estimation accuracy. It will also lead to two additional but very important advantages. First, SyncTwin enables individualized error control. For each target individual, it can inform the user whether to trust the estimate or not. Understanding the failure cases of the model is crucial for mission-critical applications such as healthcare. When a reliable estimation cannot be made, the user of SyncTwin can be alerted and fall back to expert judgments. Secondly, SyncTwin also enables explainability by examples. This means that it can explain the estimation of a target individual based on a small subset of contributors, which are deemed similar to the target by the algorithm. The user can examine these contributors to understand and reason about the estimates. This is in contrast with the existing black box models. SyncTwin consists of 3 steps: encode, synthesize, and estimate. In the encoding step, a neural network encoder translates the longitudinal covariates before the treatment into a representation vector. The representation is learned to satisfy 2 requirements. First, it can predict the outcomes with a linear model. And secondly, it can reconstruct the covariates given a suitable decoder. SyncTwin is agnostic to the exact encoder architecture, but we found an RNN encoder with attention to perform well in the experiments. In the second step, we select and weight individuals from the control group such that the convex combination of these contributors match the target individual in the representation space. In other words, the synthetic twin representation is the weighted average of the contributors' representation. And these weights are found by solving this optimization problem shown here. In the final estimation step, the same sets of weights are applied to the outcomes before and after treatments. This is to say that our final estimate is an weighted average of the contributors' outcomes, shown in this equation. Note that we can estimate outcomes before and after treatment. The difference in outcome after treatments gives the ITE estimates, and the difference before the treatment is used to compute the individualized error, which is discussed later. SyncTwin relies on the standard assumptions in causal inference, including consistency and no anticipation. We also assume that outcomes are generated by a latent factor model, as shown in this equation. The factor model assumption is not too restrictive in practice because the latent factors can relate to the covariates in a complex and nonlinear way. We show formally that under these assumptions, the error in pretreatment outcomes, dy, can be used to bound the error on counterfactual outcomes. This provides a way to control the error on the individual level and has the benefits discussed before. In addition to extensive simulation study, we performed a real data study to see if SyncTwin is able to reproduce the finding of a large-scale randomized controlled trial. Clinical trials are the gold standard for causal inference. The trial we consider is the heart protection study, and it estimates the statin's cholesterol lowering effect. It reports an average effect of negative 1.26 millimole per liter in the first year follow-up. We apply SyncTwin to a cohort selected from the EHR. Since this is an observational dataset, it contains the confounding bias due to non-random treatment allocation. We found that SyncTwin produces a very similar ATE estimate, whereas the baseline methods fail. I'd like to point out here that we compared the ATE for model validation, but SyncTwin is able to estimate the treatment effect on individual level, the ITE. If you are interested in further details, please read our paper and check out the links below. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time for our second of these this double header from Zhaozhi's NeurIPS 2021 papers, which is on estimating multi-cause treatment effects.
Hello, welcome to the presentation of estimating multi-cause treatment effects via single-cause perturbation. This work is done by me and my collaborator Alicia Curth and my supervisor Mihaela. The field of treatment effect estimation attempts to uncover the causal effect from observational data. The conditional average treatment effect, or CATE, is used to capture the heterogeneity in the effects. A well-known challenge for treatment effect estimation is the confounding bias due to non-randomized treatment allocation. As illustrated in this figure, the confounder X influences both treatment A and outcome Y. This creates a spurious correlation and may bias the estimate. The conventional problem setting only considers the single-cause intervention, where only one variable can be intervened on. Here, the variable A is one-dimensional, and we represent the usage of a single medication. In this work, we tackle the problem of multi-cause CATE estimation. The multi-cause setting is a natural extension to the conventional single-cause setting. Here, multiple causes, A1, A2, up to A3, can be simultaneously intervened on, and the treatment is determined by the configuration of all causes. An example treatment can be to use the medication A1 and A2, but not A3. Note that there may also be causal structure between the causes. For instance, A1 may enhance the chance of A2 in observational data. A practical scenario that this can arise is that A2 is a drug that can mitigate the side effect of A1. Hence, when the clinicians prescribes A1, they are more likely to prescribe A2. The confounder X may influence at least one cause and the outcome. Multi-cause CATE estimation is important because real-world decision problems usually involve acting on multiple variables simultaneously. It is especially important in healthcare applications. For instance, treating complex systemic disease such as cancer requires a combination of multiple drugs and therapies. Treating patients with long-term diseases also involve combining medications. What is the effect of combining diabetes drug with hypertension drug? As another example, polypharmacy or unnecessary usage of medication is very common in the current medical practice. An important step to tackle polypharmacy is to understand the incremental effect of a drug in presence of other drugs. Multi-cause CATE estimation is challenging because the combinatorial treatments are confounded. Consider the case with K binary causes. In combination, it gives rise to 2 to the power of K possible treatments. Yet we only observe one factual outcome out of the many potential outcomes. This is illustrated in the table. However, the challenge goes beyond data scarcity. Remember that our objective is causal inference, and we need to address the confounding bias. and remove the spurious correlation. With a large number of treatments, overcoming confounding bias becomes very challenging. In particular, the existing methods designed for single cause estimation often fail to scale with the combinatorial treatments. For instance, the popular multi-head neural network architecture uses one output head for each treatment. Hence, the number of output heads would also grow exponentially. The propensity score-based methods face a similar challenge because they estimate the probability of each treatment. The existing method for multi-cause estimation leverages additional assumptions to simplify the problem. They often assume a simple and parametric model for outcome or treatment assignment, for instance, a linear model. Other methods assume low rankedness or latent variable structure, which allow them to implicitly reduce the dimensionality of the problem. However, these assumptions are at times too strong and may limit the scope of application. In this work, we propose a novel approach to address multi-cause K estimation called single-cause perturbation, or SCP. It leverages existing single-cause estimators as building blocks and addresses confounding by explicit data augmentation. The method is easy to implement and does not take any assumption on the functional form. Instead, it relies on the knowledge about the causal structure between the causes. In healthcare applications, this can be obtained from the clinicians or medical guidelines. SCP is a two-step procedure. It first trains a set of auxiliary models to predict the counterfactual outcomes under single-cause intervention. These predicted counterfactuals are pulled into an augmented dataset. This is shown in the table, where the green cells are the imputed counterfactual outcomes. In the second step, it uses covariate adjustment on the augmented dataset to estimate the multi-cause K. To estimate the effect of single-cause intervention, we need prior knowledge on causal structure between the causes. Specifically, we assume that for a given cause AK, the rest of the causes can be partitioned into its non-decedents and its decedents. Note that such partition is always possible under directed acyclic causal graphs, or DAGs. Then we create new confounders and new outcomes by combining these variables. This in fact leads to the familiar causal DAG, and the causal estimation problem can be solved by any existing single cause algorithm. It is worth comparing our procedure with traditional data augmentation, widely used in computer vision to improve generalization and robustness. Traditionally, data augmentation is used to remove spurious correlation with non-causal variables. Here we show an example where X is an image, C is the rotation applied to the image, and Y is the label. The rotation is irrelevant to the relationship between the image and the label, but it may create spurious correlation. To tackle this, we can intervene on the rotation variable and create an augmented dataset of counterfactuals. In this respect, SCP's data augmentation serves the same purpose. It attempts to remove the confounding bias in the treatment assignment. However, in traditional data augmentation, the intervention effect is known. For instance, one can use an image processing software to rotate the images. But for SCP, the causal effect of a single cause intervention is unknown a priori and needs to be estimated by the single cause K estimators. This introduces an extra source of error compared with the conventional setting. After obtaining the augmented data, SCP applies covariate adjustment. It may use any supervised learning algorithm to estimate the expected outcomes. The user may choose a suitable model class based on the application. We validated SCP in a range of synthetic and semi-synthetic datasets. We examined a large number of situations with different number of variables, sample sizes, confounding strengths, and so on. SCP's performance is consistently strong in these experiments. We also conduct ablation studies and stress tests to better understand the performance. If you are interested in knowing more about this work, please read our paper and check out the following useful links. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Zhaozhi. So now it is time for our Q&A on the presentations that you've just seen. So just a couple of quick ground rules. These are the usual rules for our Q&A, so you might be familiar with them. But if you do have any remaining questions, we have a bunch lined up. But if you have any other questions, please post them into the Slack chat in the Inspiration Exchange channel. When we get to your question, we'll ask you to unmute yourself. At which point, please let us know which presentation you're asking about, and try to keep your question, if possible, to about 1 minute per question, so that we can spend about 2 minutes-ish on each question and answer combination. And then when you have finished and you've got your answer and we can move on, please just remember to remute yourself so we don't continue to hear you. So again, for this section, we are kind of targeting questions that are specifically related to the presentations that you've just seen. So these will mainly be handled by Alicia and Zhaozhi. So I believe our first question is from Vishnu Chandrabalan. Vishnu, if you want to go ahead and ask. And I think it was related. Actually, it's kind of for both, Alicia and Zhaozhi.
But first, thank you, Nick and Mihaela. It's been a while since I've attended these fantastic presentations from both Zhaozhi and Alicia. I'm a clinician, I'm a consultant surgeon, so I won't pretend that I understood most of your presentations, but it's fascinating stuff. So my question is, what is the data that you use to train your models and to do all of your work? And if it is synthetic data, how confident are you that the synthetic data is as close to the real world data as possible? Because you're trying to address some really complex problems here. And is there a risk that there's a risk of building a house of cards, so to speak? Is there a risk, and how do you mitigate against the risk? I've seen some of your work on generating synthetic data.
Yeah, so I think this is a really great question and a huge problem, because the issue is that by the fundamental problem of causal inference, it's impossible to use real world data to estimate to evaluate whether or not a treatment effect model is correct, because for no patient ever do you actually observe both counterfactuals at the same time. So this is what you would need to do to evaluate a individualized treatment effects model. So indeed, we have been relying on synthetic data, or let's say semi-synthetic data, where the outcomes are simulated. And we've actually written the paper that I quickly skipped over, but I didn't actually mention. We've actually written a recent paper about how bad most of the semi-synthetic data sets actually are that are out there. And so we've also only used these semi-synthetic data sets. And the one thing that we have done to try to mitigate the problem that some of them may be unrealistic is that we've just ran a lot of experiments across a lot of different data sets. So across a lot of different semi-synthetic or synthetic responses. But yeah, it's a huge problem that there is no real data to validate against without further assumptions. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Zhaozhi, maybe you can say something about your Sync2In paper and what data we use there, because there we used much more realistic data from CPRD.
Yes. So the other alternative way to validate a treatment effect estimation procedure is to try to replicate a clinical trial, because clinical trials are is the gold standard of causal inference. It's fully randomized, placebo-controlled. And the premise is that if we are able to replicate the findings of a clinical trial using confounded observational data, this will give us some confidence about the method itself. But however, most clinical trials only report average treatment effect, but the method presented in this session may be able to even go further and estimate individualized effects. But again, validating on a real clinical trial setting will give us is a source of confidence.
Thank you both. It is a complex problem, but I'm sure the next question that was in the Slack channel will dovetail very nicely into what I've just asked as to how do you translate your work into the real world, but I'll let the next speaker ask. Thank you.
Yep. So indeed, the next question in the chat was from Jakob. So Jakob, if you're ready and able, would you mind going ahead?
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. So I think, as Mihaela said as well, I think it's really important that we have these conversations and discussions about these assumptions. It's great that we have the space here where we can all meet from wherever we come from today. And so I think just a concrete question would really help here to start the discussion is, do you, as the creator, Alicia, about the survey method, do you think these assumptions are realistic for a clinical setting? And at what point would you be confident enough to actually put this into the hand of a practitioner? Would it be after some kind of RCT validation? And what would you do if there was no RCT to evaluate it because it's too expensive or because it's unethical? What are we left with to choose from if we want to develop these methods and help practitioners?
I think these are actually two questions, right? Both very difficult, very important questions. So on the assumption side, so on the one hand, let's say these are the absolute standard assumptions in this literature, both on the side of treatment effect estimation and the censoring at random assumption. Of course, that doesn't necessarily make them true by default. But I have to say, I am not a clinician. I am a statistician. So what I need to put this into the hands of, into practice is I need to talk to a domain expert, and we need to sit down and think about, okay, do these assumptions hold? Do we have, like in the case of unconfoundedness, can we think of any hidden confounders that we think will invalidate this assumption? And the same with the censoring at random assumption. If individuals are censored, for example, due to competing risks, probably the censoring at random assumption does not hold. But this is a conversation that is, let's say, it's not method dependent. This is problem application dependent. So I would need to sit with an application expert. Yes,
Alicia, if you allow me to jump in. So Jacob, we have, exactly as Alicia said, we need conversations with clinicians to understand what's possible, what they would like to see. And there is a parallel engagement session that our lab runs that's not open to machine learners, but it can be viewed by machine learners. It's open to clinicians. And there is a previous version of Revolutionizing Healthcare in September, where we discuss exactly problems like this with clinicians. So please take a look to see some of the discussions, because that led to a very interesting discussion using a demonstrator as to how they can use it, how they can debug these tools, how they can get more comfortable. It's not a complete solution, but is a beginning of a conversation. Sorry, Alicia, to jump in, but and we will put this Revolutionizing Healthcare in the chat. Actually, Nick just did it. So.
And so to your second question, I think that's an even harder question. So what would it take to actually put it in practice? So on the one hand, again, I think this takes a conversation with the person who's actually trying to put it into practice and trying to understand whether what the model outputs is sensible. So I think indeed the best way would indeed be to hold a clinical trial and see if the recommendations that come out of this make sense. And if that's not possible, I think this possibly links back to your first question that was put in the chat that we now didn't look at. So obviously, one thing you can do is have a look at what the model outputs and at least validate to some extent, does this make sense from a clinical perspective, where you need to start thinking about interpretability, which you now with the neural network may not have immediately, but if you can at least look at things like feature importance. So are these predictions that the models make, are they relying on biologically plausible features, these kind of things? But I have to say, this is a very tough question, and I'm not sure, when exactly I'd be ready to put it into practice without a trial.
Yeah, but thanks for giving it a try. Nonetheless, it was very useful. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think you can probably move on to our next question, which I believe is from Xinyue. Xinyue, if you're able, please go ahead and ask. Thanks very much. I can see you're on video now. Fantastic.
Hi. Thank you for the brilliant talks, which is really cool. I guess you kind of answered the question about my first question, how the synthetic data set was created. So I guess I will jump to the next one. Like, how do you, what metrics or methods did you use to implement the feature engineering? Because like for real world data set, we know there's a lot of it's really dirty and we have to do a lot of EDA to clean the data or augment the data. So in your case, I guess for both Alicia and Zhaozhi, how do you make sure the EDA is done right? And what are the criteria for selecting the features for training your model? Yeah, if you can just briefly talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. So variable selection and feature engineering are definitely important problems. For the project of ThinkTwin, we actually involved an epidemiologist for us to perform this variable selection, because what we really want is to ensure that those features are actually confounders. So we need to make sure that probably these features are used by the clinicians to issue treatment in clinical practice. And this requires a lot of domain knowledge and has to be done on a case-by-case basis. I think in the end, we went through a list of clinical guidelines and then come up with the list we finally used in the experiments. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So before we move on, does anyone else want to add anything else to that, or are we good to go on to our next question? Okay, probably best to move on, I think. So I think our final question then is from Diyuan Lu. Diyuan, if you're able, would you mind coming on camera and unmuting yourself? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talks. My question is addressing Zhaozhi. In your talk, or both, you have this personalized personality treatment effect, and you have this contributors, and I was just curious that how do you disentangle this person-specific information with common contributors? How do you disentangle that?
So if I understand correctly, you're asking which features are important to decide who are the contributors. It's like which features are important for us to estimate a particular level of treatment response.
Yeah, like a personalized.
Yes, I think this is so. In view of interpretability, the ThinkTwin method is trying to employ example-based interpretability. Basically, is to try to find patients that are similar to the target patients. The other form of interpretability is on features. It's trying to interpret whether the features are important. For example, the feature importance scores that you might want to obtain from those models. And actually, we've done follow-up work on ThinkTwin that we develop a method to infer the feature importance score from those contributors. So you will be able to see which features are actually important to each IT estimates. So this is in actually a follow-up work we done afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, just before we go, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about our plans for our next session. So our 13th session will take place on December 2nd. The topic of that session will be basically how we can make machine learning models more useful and robust. And this is something that I think deserves a little more explanation, which we'll provide in the coming weeks as we get closer to that session. It is a very, very important topic, and we're very much looking forward to introducing it. Also, a quick reminder that the session that you're watching now will soon be on YouTube within basically just a matter of days. So I think by the end of the week. So look out for that. I'll send you an email about that in due course. And in the meantime, again, so I did mention this, but if you are interested, please do visit our recruitment page and sign up for our December meet and greet session. And again, you can do that on our website just by clicking the Join Us button. And other than that, just a sort of a little bit of lab announcements. We recently announced that 5 new PhD students joined our team very recently. We have an announcement about that on our homepage. And also 3 of our researchers, 1 postdoc and 2 PhD students, recently just graduated from our lab. And also, I definitely would recommend, if you do have any time for this, please do give a quick look to our 2021 open house kind of video collection, which again, you can just find on our lab's homepage in our news items. Other than that, if you do want to stay up to date with these sessions, you can always just check out our dedicated page for the Inspiration Exchange engagement series. Also, of course, there is the mailing list and the Slack workspace, and I'll be providing updates through both of those. And if you do have any friends or colleagues who you think might be interested in these sessions, please do share them with them, because of course we are trying to build a community, so word of mouth is extremely important to us. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you very, very much for joining. Also, I'd like to thank Mihaela, Alicia, and Zhaozhi for your presentations and for handling the questions. And thank everyone as well, of course, for submitting the questions and for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. In the meantime, I'm really looking forward to our December 2nd session. So please just take care, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.